Hi, I'm Lindsey Smith, welcoming you to Raise the Line with Osmosis from Elsevier, an ongoing exploration about how to improve health and healthcare. As we've discussed with other recent guests, effective communication has become an increasingly critical factor to being successful in public health efforts. That's why we're turning today to an award-winning science communicator who will help us understand what it takes to earn and sustain public trust in the age of social media and AI. Jessica Malaty Rivera is an infectious disease epidemiologist who rose to prominence when she served as science communication lead for the COVID tracking project, which was considered one of the most trusted sources of pandemic data in the U.S. Her specialty is in translating complex scientific concepts into impactful, judgement-free, and accessible information for diverse audiences. Currently, she is a research fellow at Boston Children's Hospital Innovation and Digital Health Accelerator, a research fellow and Doctor of Public Health student at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health, and a senior advisor at the de Beaumont Foundation. She also dedicates several hours a week to promoting science literacy and debunking misinformation on social media. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start with your story. What first sparked your interest in getting into epidemiology and infectious disease?
Yeah, so I think like many kids who had a proclivity to, math and science, I thought I was going to be a doctor, like a traditional MD, and was pre-med in college because of that. But it was actually in college when I started taking public health courses that I realized it was the public health side of medicine that really piqued my interest. I had the fortune of basically studying public health as an undergrad while doing my pre-med prerequisites. And it was an epi class in the undergrad that made me, it clicked for me. The idea of being a disease detective, the idea of understanding the who, what, when, where, and why people get sick, and what are the ways that are even non-medical interventions that can help reduce harm. I also realized in that process that I'm very sensitive. And so the idea of going into traditional medicine was a little bit daunting to me emotionally. And when I decided to lean into that and to not go to medical school, but instead look into the intersection of health and human rights, I took a job in DC, 3,000 miles away from where I grew up in Los Angeles and where I went to college to look into that. And it was in DC that it all made sense to me. It all was like, yeah, this is the right lane for me to pivot to, and then decided to get my master's degree in emerging infectious diseases with a focus on microbiology and immunology. And the rest is history from there.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I want to talk a little bit about the COVID tracking project, and you played a key role there. What was that experience like, and how do you think the pandemic reshaped science communication?
I often refer to that time as the most meaningful chapter in my career. And I think it'll remain that way because in many ways, I trained my whole career for exactly that. I mean, when I was in graduate school the first time, I was studying emerging threats. I was working for a research group at Georgetown trying to identify the next pandemic, and we were using open source media to do that. We were trying to find those indicators and warnings of sick animals or outbreaks that were unusual in populations all over the world. And I remember my phone kind of blowing up and people saying, "Weren't you talking about this like 15 years ago?" And I would say, yes, this is exactly what we were saying was a matter of time, a matter of when, not if. And to see it kind of happen at that point, I felt so activated, like, yes, this is exactly what I've been training to do. And so when I got connected with the COVID tracking project, it felt like the honor of a lifetime to apply the skills that I had been, training and growing and finessing for so long to use it for a public audience. And because I was getting so many frequently asked questions, common questions, there were many, many themes in a lot of the uncertainty and unknowns, I decided to take my science communication public. I public with the COVID tracking project and then public even on social media. Because for the longest time, I'd been doing science communication behind the scenes with organizations that were just needing a lot of translation and explanation and sense making. And I realized that folks on the outside, folks who were even in my community, just wanted to make it all make sense so that they can have the tools in their toolkit to make informed choices. And I do think it kind of changed the game for science communication. It didn't, it wasn't the emergence of it. Science communication has existed for many, many, many years. But when you're going through a global pandemic that affects every single person on this planet, it makes the challenge of understanding science that much more big. And I think because of that, being a person who speaks the language of science and can translate it simply, it felt like the work was more timely than ever.
Absolutely. And that must have been a incredibly meaningful and both demanding time in your life. And on a personal note, I think during COVID is when I first found you on social media and started following you. And I think it's amazing how the pandemic forced a lot of people to rethink how we communicate science in real time. And that's how we started the Raise the Line podcast as well during that time, just to kind of get accurate information out on a regular cadence. Something that you said a little bit ago about effective science communication, I want to come back to. So, in today's climate, what are some of the most important do's and don'ts?
There's a quote by Sir Mark Walport that has been etched in my brain since I first read it, and it's that science isn't finished until it's communicated. And I have added to that quote and said it's not finished until it's communicated with empathy. And I think that's what's often missing. A lot of scientists are not trained in science communication. It's a different skill. And I'm very fortunate to have been specifically trained in it and have been in it for quite a while and understand that it is not just simply dumbing things down. It's not simply just debunking misinformation. It is so much more complicated and complex than that and nuanced than that. Making science make sense requires a knowledge of psychology, a knowledge of statistics, a knowledge of culture, a knowledge of the science itself, but also the science and how it applies to history and population health. And so you have to have a very holistic view on what you're actually doing. Otherwise, you're going to get trapped in either a very overly simplistic version of science communication, which is just whack-a-mole of debunking, or assuming that the messages that you're creating are a one-size-fits-all. And that's very, very misguided. One of the biggest don'ts, I think, is to treat science communication as, a way to dunk on bad news, bad information, and make it more polarizing than it is. I think that it is the information ecosystem that we exist in right now is so fraught because the emotions are so high, right? And if you think about the success of mis and disinformation, a lot of times it's successful because of how emotionally charged it is. So if we're not thinking about emotional intelligence and empathy in our evidence-based science communication, we're missing an opportunity to help people remove the fear and transition into confidence and strength in their ability to understand something. I've always said that I don't like the idea of dumbing things down. I'd much rather have the challenge of elevating people's science literacy and understanding. And that is a really high task, right? I don't expect people, the general audience, to remember basic biology from high school or college. It's my job to remember it. But it's also my job to not make you feel ashamed for not remembering it. So how can I communicate this by not adding to the paranoia, the fear, the anxiety, the doubt, the uncertainty that already exists in unprecedented public health emergencies?
That's a really helpful breakdown. I like what you said there about empathy. And I think these days the stakes feel higher than ever. And it's really easy for audiences to get overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Let's kind of shift our attention to infodemiology, field that many people in our audience may not be familiar with. Can you help us define it and tell us what it is?
Essentially, the simplest way to describe it is, epidemiology asks us who, what, when, where, and why a disease is affecting a population. Infodemiology is asking very similar questions: who, what, when, where, why, about the information and how the information is influencing decision-making, health decision-making in particular, and population decision-making. And so I look at both of these things as drivers of public health emergencies and exacerbators of public health emergencies. And they often exist in tandem. When there is an epidemic, there is an infodemic. And I think a lot of times there is an assumption that an infodemic just means all bad information, mis and disinformation in particular, conspiracies and rumors, but it's really just too much information. If you think about the digital landscape that we live in right now, too, even the volume of content for trained eyes is overwhelming to consume. It's overwhelming to navigate through and identify what are trusted messages, what are trusted sources. And so it's almost like drinking out of a fire hose. This is the visual that I think about when I think about an infodemic. It's just so much content, so much information that makes it really difficult to know who to trust and why to trust them. Infodemiology is trying to help bring that concept into every industry, because it's not just health, right? It's politics, it's democracy, it's law, it's AI. Infodemiology is a very ubiquitous tool in asking how information, the use of it, the maluse of it, is an influence in how people are making decisions.
Thank you for that great overview. And it kind of ties in beautifully to our next question here about being able to decipher misinformation. What are some of the most effective tools and strategies you can tell our audience about for combating infodemics and misinformation?
Yeah, I sometimes I cringe a little bit at the word misinformation because it's almost lost its meaning. Unfortunately, it's become such a polarizing word. It's a bit of a slur in the same way that fake news has kind of become a joke. Misinformation is a very precise term. It is information that is incorrect that can cause harm. Now, its intent is what is variable. It is not always intending to be harm. And oftentimes it's shared with benign intent or just intent to just share information, but somebody hasn't done the due diligence to make sure that it's accurate. And so I think we should really diversify our lexicon first when it comes to how we are categorizing information. And so I often like to use the word rumor or, a circulating narrative or a frequently asked question or an information gap. Sometimes all of this is people who just don't know the answer to a question or the answer to an idea. And I think if we just overuse the word misinformation, what that does is it creates more binary thinking. And binary thinking is why we're in the situation that we're in right now. I mean, I'm gesturing broadly at kind of the information ecosystem that we're all kind of dealing with. And I think that when we do that, then it becomes, well, your truth, my truth, or alternative facts or real facts. And I just think that that is how people get stuck in which team am I going to support and not thinking about the very iterative and very, infinite shades of gray reality of science. Science rarely exists in binaries. And I think that if we can help people understand that misinformation is a very real threat, but not everything that is not true is misinformation, is the kind of discernment that I really want to help people achieve. Because information can be benign. There can also be disinformation, which is intending to harm. There is a distinction there where the person who is sharing it, the entity that is sharing it, is wanting to sow confusion or panic or even rumor and conspiracy for either political, economic, or even gain in science. And I think that having people be better consumers of information will give them that type of clarity to say, well, this probably is not intending to cause harm, and this one is intending to cause harm. This makes me feel this type of way. This does not make me feel some type of way. And a lot of it is almost just like checking in with yourself. How am I receiving this information? How am I reacting to it? And I think helping people ask those questions when they read any piece of information is going to help people have better understanding of what type of information it is.
Those are really great strategies. And I know these rumors and narratives and knowledge gaps has been a hot topic on the podcast this year. And it's interesting to see how quickly these narratives evolve and how important it is to stay kind of agile in responses as well. What advice would you give to scientists or even medical professionals who want to improve their communication skills and build a meaningful online presence like you have?
I think it's everybody's job in science to be a science communicator. Now, it doesn't have to look the same way. I don't think everybody needs to be on social media with lots of followers and doing it in the same way, the same cadence. I'll be honest, it is an incredibly challenging thing to do, especially becoming a public figure. While I can say honestly the good outweighs the bad is very, very bad. And I don't wish a lot of the bad on anybody, even my worst enemies. And I don't really have any enemies, but it comes at a cost, and I don't think it needs to look one way. I think effective science communication for a provider looks like really spending more time with the parent who's asking questions in earnest and making them not feel ashamed for bringing up something that they read online, and instead of saying instead of dismissing it, saying that's stupid, that's misinformation, that's a lie, asking them, how'd you get that information? Tell me how you found that to be trustworthy. How can I help you make an informed choice that will, make your fears, less concerning to you? Those are all part of a system that is under the umbrella of science communication. It's not all reels and TikTok videos. Sometimes it's papers, sometimes it's articles in a newspaper, sometimes it's a podcast interview like this. Sometimes it's going to your community, whether it's a faith-based community or your mahjong club or a mom's group, and talking to people about the things that you're an expert in and helping people make better choices using evidence-based science. I would say that to lean into the discomfort of a skill that they may not have had specific training in, and it's something that you can learn. I mean, I wasn't obviously born a science communicator. I learned it through my training, and I've loved seeing a lot of providers and clinicians and researchers and scientists of various backgrounds pick this new skill up and do it because they know that we are living in really uncertain times and that people are insatiably curious and hungry for this content. So I would say have less focus on the, large following on social media and think about the impact you can have with one person. Because if we're thinking specifically about, say, vaccines, one person changing their mind on vaccines has a huge impact on community health. If you think about that one person and how they can be a barrier to getting and spreading a disease. So I look at the individual numbers as success and much more meaningful than large followings and platforms.
That's really encouraging advice for our listeners. And three things that I've kind of noticed in following you over a number of years is your authenticity, your reliability, and your consistency, which I think would be other good tips to pass along to the group as well. So AI generated videos, they've become increasingly realistic and accessible. How do you see this technology influencing the fight against rumors or knowledge gaps or misinformation?
I mean, it already has. I think that AI, and I feel like every time I talk about AI, the conversation will be dated in like 24 hours because it's constantly changing and evolving. But AI can be a tool for good and it can be a tool for harm in every industry, not just science and science communication. I think that plenty of science communicators can benefit from using AI for, creating visuals that, they may not have the graphic design ability to do. But I also think that if an over-reliance on it, either from a good intent or a bad intent, can create the things that we've all kind of seen be very dangerous to information ecosystems. That's hallucinated information, hallucinated citations even. We saw that with the Maha report. A hallucinated citation has huge implications for academic integrity, for even integrity of plagiarism and honesty in that work. I mean, one of the things that I think I made very clear when I was going online to do this work was I'm never going to speak outside of my expertise, right? And I think that AI can possibly be tempting folks to speak on topics that they may not have expertise because they asked a chatbot or they looked it up online and then created a really beautiful visual. That's very, very dangerous, in my opinion. I know my limitations. I'm not going to speak on treatments, for instance, because I'm not a provider. I don't have that training. AI, I think, if it's not used carefully and if it's not used with a type of disclosure of this is what I used for this content, or these are citations that are legitimate that I've double checked through due diligence, it can be really harmful. But I was just at a health tech conference and saw the amazing innovation that AI is doing for so many things in health and science. And I don't like to think about it as just a monolith. It's many, many things, but I also think it requires a huge amount of wisdom and caution.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Exciting and also a little scary at the same time. I liked what you emphasized there about over-reliance and also kind of staying in your lane.
Yeah.
So I want to shift gears and talk about Osmosis a little bit. As you know, we're a teaching company. We love to fill knowledge gaps. And I wanted to ask you if there is a topic you think Osmosis should make a video about to fill a gap that is of particular concern or of interest to you.
Oh, that's such a good question. Lindsay, I feel like right now we are in a bit of a weird timeline where we are relitigating a lot of established science. And it's hard to see that But I also think that one of the most successful tactics in science communication is repetition. Sometimes it takes several messages of the same message, but perhaps slightly different with a different tone, different format for a message to really click. I mean, they say that even about building habits. It takes many, many times to do it for it to really kind of make an imprint in your brain. And I think that we should be creating more education on the things that many people in science or even in society think are already established, but are being challenged again. That's on everything from the safety of the MMR vaccine to the reason why we vaccinate at the schedule that we do, to the reasons why fluoride fluoride in water is overall beneficial to oral hygiene and oral health for kids and even adults. I don't think that those messages are belabored when you keep talking about them. I think they are necessary to be repeated. But if I were to pick one topic, though, I think it would be on infodemiology. I mean, I'm biased, but I think it's on training people to understand, like, we don't live in a world anymore where information can be neutral or be perceived as neutral. And so how do we train people because I don't expect everybody to become an epidemiologist, but maybe we can have people become infodemiologists, right? Where they are understanding the who, what, when, where, and why of information and how it is informing either their own decision-making and biases or the decision-making and biases of people around them.
That's a fantastic suggestion. We'll certainly pass that along to our content team for review and follow back up with you if we are ever able to create that content.
Great.
So in our audience, we have many students and early career health professionals. I wanted to ask you what your advice is to them about meeting the challenges of this moment and approaching their career in healthcare.
Yeah. I think that the success, air quote success that I've had is in large part due to the fact that I, as a human to another human, and I'm trying to bring back the humanity of science, right? I think people look at science as a capital S, public health, capital P, capital H, as these very distant institutions that are elite and separate from society. And I think that when I speak to folks with my face showing, with my children squawking in the background, with my mom hat on, it's made me more relatable to an audience that is very, very emotionally charged, very polarized, very confused about who to trust and why should they trust the people that are speaking loudly on the internet. And I think that my biggest advice is to lean into all the identities that you have that can make you connect with an audience that is not looking for a perfect, polished answer. They're looking for a human to speak to them like a human. And I think that that's why I've been able to have people stay so long and to listen so earnestly and to continue to ask questions, because I'm answering like a mom, or I'm answering like a resident of San Francisco, or I'm answering like a person who is as frustrated by XYZ situation as the people that I'm seeing screaming on the internet. And so I think that there's many ways to be a scientist, to be a clinician, to be a provider. But I think the diversity of that group that fills those jobs is the beauty of it, and to lean into that. If you are from a community that is underserved and underrepresented in this space, lean into that identity and speak as a person who can represent them. I know that I have more success talking to some audiences than I do others. And I lean into that. And I think that there is a really cool shift that has happened because of social media that has made that more obvious. It's kind of brought people into people's homes, for lack of better words, or into their pockets, even with a provider who can make it make sense to them really simply. I mean, I think a lot of my friends and even, followers who have become friends refer to me as their like phone a friend, but like phone an epi. I think that is a huge honor. And what a great opportunity for providers who are not stuck, who don't have to be stuck with make an appointment with the front desk, to connect with people and to talk to them like a human.
That's a really grounding message. I appreciate your human-focused approach, and I know our audience will as well. Before we wrap up today's episode, is there anything that we didn't cover that maybe we should have?
I think one thing I think about a lot, and I think it's probably because I have 3 young kids who are all under the age of 10, is that so much of this focus on understanding and science communication and even education focuses on our later years when we're, in our advanced education, higher education. And I just feel like we need to be bringing this to the kids. We need this type of understanding in elementary education. I mean, my kids are existing in a world that is so different than the one that I grew up in. Mine was very analog. I didn't have a phone until college. I didn't have social media until college. And that's different from the world that my kids are living in right now. So how do we raise a generation to be digitally literate and savvy on all the things we just talked about? Science, AI, health information, health misinformation, infodemics, and epidemics. And I feel like if we want to raise a generation that is going to be navigating very, very confusing information ecosystems, we can't wait until they're in college to start teaching them these skills.
That's a really good point. Something for us all to think about. Thank you so much for being with us today, Jessica, and for sharing your insights on building trust, fighting misinformation, and leading with empathy in science communication.
Thank you so much for having me, Lindsey.
And that's a wrap on today's episode. If you wish to follow Jessica's work, we will put her information in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to check out other episodes. I'm Lindsey Smith. Thanks for checking out today's show. Remember to do your part to raise the line and strengthen the healthcare system. We're all in this together.
If you like this podcast, please share it on your social channels. You can also subscribe to the series and check out all of our episodes at osmosis.org/raisethelinepodcast.